Welcome back to Drunk on Writing and what is, sadly, the end of our extended look into Stephen King's Pet Sematary. In today's episode, we are rounding out our discussion by looking at the 2019 film adaptation, directed by Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer, which I wish we had a better word than adaptation for this one. I'm sure the Germans probably have the exact sort of word that I'm looking for, and here we are in English, and I can't even use one word to describe shaking my head, right? Because this film goes in such a different direction than the previous adaptations, or really even the book. Intentionally, of course, as Widmyer explained to Screen Rant in a 2019 interview. It was our job to get to the essence of the novel, he said, while at the same time doing new things for fans in 2019. Added Kölsch, our goal was always to serve both audiences, the die-hard fans, but also fans who had never even heard of Pet Sematary, had never seen the first movie or read the book. We were always walking that tightrope. And, spoilers ahead, do new things they did. Something the film's first full trailer actually clued audiences in on ahead of time. Yeah, instead of following the book, the first film adaptation, and the audio dramatization before it, in this film, they kill Ellie. Actually, boiling it down to just that, I feel, would do a disservice to the story, written by Geoff from a screen story by Matt Greenberg, because they don't just kill Ellie here. That may be the main takeaway, but they made Ellie feel like a character in this story for what seems to be the very first time. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as I always tend to do. So let me just say before we get into all of this, if you enjoy this episode, please be sure to give it a like. Please leave a comment below. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to the channel. Please head on over to drunkonwriting.com and sign up to become a patron, where you can get more episodes more often, as well as a bevy of fun little goodies. Like I have a wallpaper that I just threw up. It's fun little exclusives like that. Now, before we dive into the film itself, and now that I've given the nice little spiel, this movie has something of an interesting story to it, as so many of these Pet Sematary pieces tend to, right? It's very interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I try to follow the breadcrumbs back, and well, it's pretty apt to call what this film went through as development hell. Like this is very much the definition of development hell, because the furthest I got back, the first mention of what would eventually be this film, I found back in 2003, when the horror aficionados over at Bloody Disgusting reported that Pet Sematary 3, based on a script written back in 1993 but shelved due to Part 2's sort of lukewarm response, was a go for a 2004 release. Obviously, no, that didn't happen. By 2006, but reportedly as early as 2004, the narrative had changed rather drastically. Possibly because of the success of 2003's rebooted Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which helped launch a slew of remakes. Yes, gone was Pet Sematary 3, in was just Pet Sematary, with George Clooney, of all people, set to star, and based on a script by Dave Kojenik, who would also later sign on to write a new adaptation of It, though we'll talk about that in another episode a little bit more down the line. That script was completed back in 2005, but never, obviously, made it to the screen thanks to, as Kojenik put it in a 2010 interview with King fansite Lilia's Library, a regime change. Pet Sematary is my favorite King novel, he said, and adapting it was one of the best screenwriting experiences I've had, creatively speaking. In its modern way, I think it is easily the equal of anything in the literary canon by Hawthorne or Poe, so I approached the book as a piece of literature as opposed to a horror concept to be pillaged. It was a pure pleasure. After I turned in my first draft, Paramount went through a top-down regime change, and I was given a new executive who had creative ideas I just couldn't stand behind. They wanted to appeal to younger audiences, so there was talk of making a teenaged Ellie the main character, and etc. It was really heartbreaking, but that's how the process works sometimes. The studio was gracious enough to let me out of my contract, and the project was dormant at the studio until very recently. I can only assume the quote-unquote regime change mentioned here was Chairwoman Sherry Lansing's 2005 departure, or possibly the earlier abrupt resignation of Viacom's entertainment chief Jonathan Dolgen. Lots going on behind the scenes at this time, but honestly, I feel like there's already been enough Hollywood inside baseball in like the 10 minutes that I've been talking, so I really don't feel like going into it. So let's get back to Pet Sematary, and that, what Kujinik described, it's not all that different from what we ended up getting in 2019, is it? But that, what was it, until very recently he mentioned, was March 2010, when Lorenzo di Bonaventura comes onto the film as a producer and brings in Matt Greenberg, who just adapted Stephen King's 1408. We'll come back to that in another episode as well, eventually. He'd also handled revisions back in 1995 on Children of the Corn 3. So he's got a nice history of King attachments here. Now, he turns in his script back in February 2011 when, as the LA Times report, they were also seeking a high-level director to tackle the material. Apparently, several were met with, but of the names that made it to press as actually being attached to direct, we had, in August 2011, The Hills Have Eyes director Alexandra Aja, and, in November 2013, 28 weeks later director Juan Carlos Fresnadillo. While he obviously inevitably did not direct the film, Fresnadillo did have a lasting impression on what we would eventually get by bringing on board screenwriter Jeff Bula. He would make it to the 2019 version, which, again, seems rather similar to this version at this time, given what Bula described to Dread Central back in 2014. This is pretty far from the 1980s film, he said. With this one, we really wanted to get into the emotional aspects of it. There's still plenty of visceral horror that's explored, but I've always felt that if you lean more into the characters and into their emotional lives, when the visceral shit hits the fan, it's 10 times more scary. He did also add, however, this update on the film. Right now, the film's budget is up for approval at the studio. We have the new script completed and will be ready to go when Juan Carlos returns from New York in August. Or not, really. At this point, the project just went dormant, as was said earlier. Fresnadillo went off and directed other projects. Bula went off and wrote other projects. And this new Pet Sematary was seemingly dead in the water. I mean, it would continue to pop up every now and again. In 2015, Guillermo del Toro got a bunch of people kind of excited and talking about it again when he tweeted he'd kill to make Pet Sematary on film, and Mary Lambert, director of the original film adaptation as well as its sequel, obviously, shortly afterward added to that speculation, added to that discourse when she told Filmmaker magazine in that interview that I've already referenced a couple times, I think, across this series, I wish them luck on a remake. They've been trying to do a remake for years now, and they can't come up with a script that's better than the original one. Maybe they will finally do it. The studio has been talking about it for about 10 years now. They've called me several times, not to direct it, but to see if I can talk with this person or that person, etc. Is Guillermo del Toro involved? I forget who's involved with it now. She also told them about her concept for a Pet Sematary 3. I've included the interview in the show notes below, so feel free to give it a read. I'm not going to rehash it here, but I wouldn't mind seeing it. Honestly, if she continued up the series, we've seen weirder things happen. But yeah, the project seemed to be gone. I mean, it was just shelved, right? Until in August 2017, IT director Andres Muschietti fueled even more speculation when he told the Toronto Sun, and just before we get into this quote, the we that he's referring to is him and his sister, producer and screenwriter Barbara Muschietti. We're huge fans of Pet Sematary. If we can get our hands on that and do the Pet Sematary we want to do, that will be something. One day, maybe. It should come as no surprise that people got in a bit of an uproar about that at that time. But speaking of it, like I said earlier, we're going to save the majority of this part of the discussion for those eventual dissections. But it's worth noting here that this Pet Sematary adaptation likely never would have seen the light of day without it. Debuting September 5th, 2017, it went on to earn over $700 million at the box office, breaking The Exorcist's 44-year run to become the highest-grossing horror film of all time, adjusted for inflation, of course. But a record it still holds to this day, and one that probably will hold for a little while longer, given how the theaters have been performing of late. But we're not going to talk about all of that because that all sucks. But only a month after it smashed that record and made all those headlines, Paramount, obviously seeing the dollar signs associated with the King name, doubled down on the author, and finally, after 14 years or so, and apparently after meeting with a slew of other directors like Sean Carter and Johan Roberts, a few names that are out there, more indie film sort of directors rather than the big names like Guillermo del Toro and all those other ones, solidified the Pet Sematary remake by officially tapping Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer to direct. The two had previously co-directed the terribly unsettling Starry Eyes, which, if you haven't seen but you enjoyed this take on Pet Sematary, do yourself a favor and go watch it. It's only about an hour long, and the lead, Alexandra Esso, is just utterly fantastic. It's such a good movie. Plus, I think it's still available on Amazon Prime, so easy to watch, and a perfect template to leverage a Stephen King adaptation to. So I can understand why the directors were brought on as they were. Though there is a bit more to the story than just them having some incredible talent, as they told Screen Rant in a 2019 interview. This movie was on our radar as early as 2015, said Widmyer. It was a studio film, but it was still such an indie film. It was something that was very near and dear to us. It didn't feel like doing a studio job for the sake of doing a studio job to try to help our career. It felt like something we wanted to do no matter what. We kept an eye on it, and then in 2017, late summer into the earlier fall, the director was no longer attached, and they were taking meetings. We had a host of, maybe a dozen meetings with many different people at Paramount, all the producers, over the course of the fall of 2017. We were on the set of Scream Season 3, and we got a phone call saying we got it. That was maybe a day before Halloween 2017. So the day before the announcement. He also added, coming back to my point about it, I think the biggest reason it got made this time is because of it. That movie came along and showed there was a new veneer you could put over Stephen King adaptations, and the time was right. People were hungry for this material again, this smart horror, which, you know what, I could go into the scant details we have surrounding the casting, or talk about the 4 cats that were used during filming, or even really go head first into the underlying current, the underlying theme of whether or not there is something after death, if there's life after death, something, anything. But I kind of don't want to do that. I feel like we've talked about that enough across these sections. I just kind of want to talk about the movie here, because after all this time about talking about Pet Sematary, I get why it's called development hell. I really do. But how good is this movie? With that, as Widmyer called it, that new veneer, the more I think about this film, the more I like it. Yeah, I could have done without the audience fake outs.
And Gage?
Of course, sweetie. Gage is just a kid.
And some of the acting was a little stiff. No pun intended here. I don't know why I couldn't think of another word. But the editing in this film alone, the set dressing, especially in the trail through Little Godswamp. No, unlike the first film adaptation, this was not required to be completely shot in Maine. In fact, I think it was completely shot in Quebec. All that, plus the camera work, the nuanced acting, even the, at times, subtle changes to pivotal moments we've come to know and sort of take for granted. I may be in the minority here, given the reviews that I've read, but I have to agree with Stephen King on this one, who said of the film, it's great. Yeah, I freaking loved it. I started this episode talking about Ellie, how this adaptation finally really makes her feel like a character within the story that we've now seen three different interpretations of, including the book. And it wasn't until my second viewing of the movie that I really understood why I felt that way. Unlike the book, unlike the other adaptations, here Ellie is not just another reskinned Carrie, not another reskinned, what was the girl from Firestarter? Not another reskinned Firestarter, not especially another reskinned Danny Torrance. Something instead reserved for Hugo and Lucas Lavoie's Gage in this take. Here, Ellie's not just seemingly crying out for attention from at least one parent who clearly loves her brother more than her. Did you think I was not going to mention that again? Though I think we'll just leave it at that. We're just going to leave it at that. She's our eyes and ears here just as much as Louis is, if not more so, though never to the point it feels detrimental to his character or even Rachel's. Through her, we explore. I mean, Ellie is the first inside the house, the first to see the pet cemetery, the first to meet Judd, the first to see the resurrected church, and, well, obviously, the first within the family to die. Truly, as a parent especially, gut-wrenching scene made all the more affected by the fantastic sound design. I should note, Ellie's played in this film by Jete Lawrence, who already had quite the resume going into this, and who, honestly, though this is going to sound really weird to say, feels like she was born to play a dead girl. The blank stares we get from her, the quirky giggles, the shambling dance later on, her embodiment of the great and terrible title bestowed upon her here. She just rocks this role, beginning to end. Plus, she gives us a quick nod to Hocus Pocus, so really, how could you not love her?
Okay.
I'll put a spell on you.
One thing I also rather appreciated were the added visual parallels between Ellie and Church. Something of an undercurrent across the entire film, and the book as well, but most prominent here with the two post-revival hairbrushing scenes and Ellie's use of the cat mask in the finale. Of course, their deaths at the hands of two relentless Orinco trucks are also rather similar. And, I've got to say, if this were me, if I were Louis, who also almost gets hit by a truck, I should note, I would burn Orinco to the ground. Or at the very least, sue them for everything that they've got. But that does bring me to an interesting point here raised by Drunk on Riding patron TheCinephiliac. We don't ever actually see Church get hit by the truck in any of the versions. Not that I'm saying I want to see a cat get hit by a truck. I'm just saying we never actually see it. We're simply always told that that is what happens. Whether here by John Lithgow's Judd, in the original film by Fred Gwynn's Judd, in the audio adaptation by Lee Montague's Judd, or even Stephen King's original version of Judd in the book. But should we actually take Judd's word for it? I never felt like I really had to doubt him at any given point. That is until now. This deliberately accentless version. Lithgow believed, and I think rightfully so, that any accent that he adopted would have simply taken viewers right out of the film, sort of like the way Daniel Craig did in Knives Out. This Judd seems more of a guardian to the trail than ever before, and also rather beaten down because of this, because of this responsibility. I mean, the nicotine-stained beard here is such a wonderful touch. And aside from the story of his dog Biffer, still a hell of a sniffer, even if he did change owners, there's an unspoken history here we're never privy to, one wherein he may have resurrected his wife Norma, and perhaps been under the Wendigo's influence for, his entire life. Of course, that influence comes directly into play with Church's burial, as Judd, for the first time in any version of this story, starts with the intention of helping Louis bury Church in the front cemetery, only to, yet again, fall under that influence, inevitably giving us a new meaning to one of the story's most infamous lines.
Once you feel the power of that place, You make up the sweetest smelling reasons to go back. But I was wrong. Sometimes dead is better.
I love that change. It gives like an entirely new meaning to the line. I enjoyed a similar twist to another classic line from the book, and I believe from the original film. This one from Jason Clark's Louis, who, just before burying Church, asks, smartly,
"What exactly are we doing here tonight, Judd?"
We're burying your daughter's cat.
And that's all.
That and nothing but.
Now, don't get me wrong. Louis has always been smart. I mean, the guy's a doctor. I mean, of course he's smart. But this Louis, Clark's Louis, is far more contemplative and decisive and seemingly capable. I mean, just look at the way he handles Victor Pascal's gruesome death here. I should add, Apsa Ahmed, who takes over the role from Brad Greenquist, does a pretty good job as Victor Pascal, though there's really not much to say about the character given the thankfully limited nature of his role within this story. So, I mean, that's good to me. I'm fine with it. So let's get back to Louis. That and his unflinching jump into action when Gage runs toward the road, the way he so nonchalantly roofies Judd, I freaking love that entire scene. The way he bounds into the cemetery without any hemming and hawing, no stipulation, no like, oh, I gotta plan this out. He just goes for it. Louis practically seems military trained in this version. He very well maybe. Judd obviously sees this smartness to him, this decisiveness in him, and if we're filling in a few of the story gaps, it's possible that this spark within him, this decisiveness, for lack of a better word, is the reason that he and Rachel moved up here from Boston. Yes, they changed that up, and that move makes far more sense in this day and age rather than the family coming from Chicago. And while we don't get it spelled out for us, my interpretation of what we're given is that the stress of the city, the stress of Louis's job were taking a toll on their marriage, taking a toll on both Rachel and Louis, and they've moved to Maine to fix that, to sort of start over, to rekindle their relationship. Though the one chance we do see at some rekindled intimacy is rather harshly interrupted by Church gnawing on a bird that's still alive. Talk about a mood killer. Ugh. And that same decisiveness, that really is what leads to the family's downfall in the end, isn't it? As Ellie tells us, Louis starts all this off by moving the family here, by burying Church in the Micmac grounds, by letting Church go. But, there's that one part where he could put Church to sleep and end everything, but he doesn't. He decides to let Church go, and from there on, it's the events are like a series of dominoes just falling around him, inevitably dooming everyone. Actually, let's come back to that because I want to talk about Rachel before we get any further here. Played by Amy Simons, who delivers what is easily the best Rachel to date. I don't blame her one bit for wanting to get the hell away from that house, which torments her with her sister Zelda's death. And what a death they give us in this film. Falling down a dumbwaiter. Horrible. Gruesome, scarring. I mean, I give Rachel credit simply for existing at this point. I mean, how hard is it to be alive knowing that, yes, she is 100% absolutely at fault for her sister's death. I mean, even if her good-for-nothing parents never should have left them alone. And I should note, they're not really in this adaptation at all. I mean, they're not named. Really, the only look at the father-in-law we get is that one icy glare that he gives Louis at the funeral. They never should have left their kids alone. I mean, they're awful people. They're awful people in every single version of this story. Though, I will say, despite this Zelda B story giving us some of the best visuals in this entire film, I never really feel like her death enmeshes itself into the plot as well as it has in past iterations, even if we consider Rachel's apparent comeuppance at her daughter's hands, which is so terrifyingly uncomfortable. I mean, it's just the way she's just sitting there twisting the knife. I hate that I love it, but it was, oh my God, it was bad. All of this, of course, leading to that ending, the family's downfall, and a sad, poetic twist on the fact that Louis was able to save his son earlier from this fate that we expected, only to deliver him into what very well may be a fate worse than death. I wonder if they could live happily ever after like that. I hope so. I certainly do hope so. I don't think so, but I do hope so. And it's possible one day we might actually find out in a sequel, given a prequel also penned by Jeff Bula, and which will debut exclusively on the Paramount Plus streaming service, has been greenlit and is set to explore the history and potential origins of the Pet Sematary. We see a little of this in the film itself with teases toward that prize bull we've heard so much about, as well as poor old Timmy Baterman. Otherwise absent from the film, though subject of a short aptly titled The Tale of Timmy Baterman. Directed by Marcus Perry, who also handled a no filming, no texting infomercial for theaters based on Pet Sematary, and filmed during the movie's production, it was later included in the Pet Sematary Blu-ray release, though Perry also dropped it online for everyone to enjoy. And how can you not enjoy John Lithgow? I mean, even this John Lithgow.
You did good, Louis. I knew you would.
So yes, it seems like Pet Sematary might continue, possibly indefinitely, as might this dissection series, which is rather interesting given how much this story has defied the odds to simply exist. I mean, if you remember back, the original book was only published because of a contract dispute. The first film adaptation was only made because of the writer's strike. This film survived over a decade in development hell and came out, and while some people really rather disliked it, I think a lot of them were just upset at the incredible change to the film, I loved it. I think it was great. I think it was smart. And, here's hoping the prequel has a smooth production. Though I've got a funny feeling it might not. This has been the Drunk on Writing dissection of the 2019 adaptation of Stephen King's Pet Sematary, and I think this is it. And I'm kind of sad because this was a fun little series. I hope you enjoyed it as well. I think I could probably go on talking about Pet Sematary for a while yet. Like I said, there are so many themes throughout all these films, so many different interpretations, so many different just thoughts thrown into here. I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed all of the adaptations. Some were more hit than miss. Some were more miss than hit. But overall, like I loved them. And now I'm a little sad that it's over. Though there is plenty of more King to come. So if you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoyed this series, please subscribe to the channel and hang out with us as we continue to talk King and all of his books, all of his stories, all of his adaptations in the coming months and years. Hopefully years. So yeah, please be sure to give this episode a like. Please share it with friends. Please subscribe to the channel. Please head on over to drunkonwriting.com where you can get more episodes more often. And I don't think I have anything more to say, so I'm just going to say cheers and keep on writing. And man, how good is Pet Sematary?